April is Poetry Month, which is celebrated in Waupaca. We have Pat Phair in the studio to talk with Wisconsin's Poet Laureate, Margaret Rozga.
Well, first of all, maybe you could give us a little bit of a criteria, even before criteria, maybe a little of your background, how you came to become interested in poetry, perhaps a little of your bio in terms of maybe what you've written and how you got to become the Poet Laureate of Wisconsin.
Okay. I can't remember a time when I didn't like to write. Even as a child, I would jot down scenes, or ideas, or words that interested me. A lot of them I squirreled away somewhere. But as I got older, as I went through school, English and literature were my favorite subjects. I tried writing fiction, tried writing stories, and even had a novel in mind at one time, but I think my mind doesn't quite work that way in terms of plot. I tend to think in terms of one thing is like another, making comparisons, making analogies, which is the basis of poetry because that's basically metaphor. I think I started to take myself seriously as a poet who wanted to publish about 30 years ago, and then worked at getting good at it. Read other poets, joined a critique group, went to poetry readings, got into the milieu, if you will, of poetry. When my children were very small, I wrote a lot of poems about how cute they were,
Sure.
the funny things they would say and do. And then I started to write. My first book was called 200 Nights and One Day. It was a set of poems about Milwaukee's fair housing marches in which I was a participant. It actually started as a play produced on the campus where I was a faculty member, the University of Wisconsin at Waupaca. And then it occurred to me, because the play had multiple monologues, that those were almost already poems, persona poems, that I could take the material from the play and turn it into poetry, and that's what I did. Mm-hmm. I have 3 other books, though I haven't been to Baghdad, is about the deployment of my son, who was an Army reservist, to Iraq, first Iraq and then Afghanistan. I don't try to tell his story. I talk about and write poems about my perception of the war and my worries about him.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's move on here just a little bit. I don't want to keep you any longer than need be. I know you have a busy schedule, but so you're the Wisconsin Poet Laureate. How does one become the Poet Laureate? Is it an application process? Is it a nomination process? Tell us how you became or received that title.
Okay. It is an application process. Even if someone else nominates you, you still have to do the application. The application consists of some background about you. You do have to have published books of poetry, and it helps if you have won awards for your poetry.
Okay. And
they want to know that background.
Sure.
And you also propose a project. If you were Poet Laureate, what kinds of ways would you bring poetry to the public, which is basically the job of the Poet Laureate. Be an ambassador for poetry, carry the enjoyment of poetry throughout the state.
So as long as you brought that up, that was going to be one of my next questions. What was the project that you proposed, and how have you followed up on that?
Well, I proposed asking people about their favorite poem. And the reason for that was that I had heard as as a faculty member and as just a person going to a dinner party or a social event, if I would say that I was a poet or I wrote poetry, a lot of people would react saying, "Oh, poetry, I don't get it." A categorical rejection. And my experience was also that most people did have a poem that they liked, so I would ask, well, what is your favorite poem? As a way of breaking down that categorical response. Nobody likes every single poem that has ever been written. Right. Everybody has some that they like and some that they don't like, or some that they don't get. Sure. But that doesn't necessarily mean to reject the whole category. So what has developed is that when I go to do a presentation, I ask at the presentation about people's favorite poems, and that starts some discussion. Also, a local paper in Milwaukee, the neighborhood in which I live, Bayview, the Bayview Compass editor asked me if I would write an article once a month about someone and their favorite poem. So I've been doing that, and at this point I have a dozen of those articles. They're available online, bayviewcompass.com. And it's interesting to see what people like and why they like it, and learn a little bit about the poem and the article.
So basically, it's you used your project or your idea as a kind of an icebreaker in social situations, and found that in fact people did enjoy at least a poem somewhere along the line. Exactly,
and some of the poems were poems that they had memorized at some point in their schooling. So those poems continue to be meaningful to them. So I just want to say thank you to all the teachers who encourage students to commit poems to heart. You give people a lifelong gift when you do that. That's what I have seen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about your project, can you fill us in a little bit on some of? Now you're poet laureate for 1 year, is that correct?
No, it's a 2-year term.
2-year stint, and when did this 2-year stint start?
January of 2019.
So you're into your second year. Can you give us a little idea of some of the responsibilities and or places you visited, and some of the interesting anecdotes since you've been poet laureate? Okay,
I put over 3,000 miles on my car driving to various places across the state. I've been to Door County, to Green Bay, to Manitowoc, and then traveled across the state to Menominee and Eau Claire, did a number of talks in Madison.
And are you asked at those different places to read some of your own poetry? Is that mainly the reason for showing up, or is it more for educational purposes?
Usually people want me to read some of my own poems, and I'm happy to do that. A lot of people ask, just as you did this morning, how do you get to be poet laureate? What do you do as poet laureate? Because I've written activist poems, social justice poems, I've been surprised at how many people have asked me to do workshops on how to write such a poem. That's what I did in Wausau last spring. So it's workshops or readings or discussions of poetry. One talk that I gave in Nequan, where I asked about favorite poems, the librarian said she had several favorite poems, and she named some well-known authors. But she had one that I had never heard of. It was a poem by Elise Chavez, and the poem was called Dating Advice from Persephone to Eurydice on Orpheus Who Won't Stop Chasing. And the opening line is, invest in running shoes.
Well, if you know your Greek mythology, that makes a lot of sense, of course.
Yes.
So, well, that sounds wonderful. You know, Waupaca has a lot of things going on in April, and we were hoping maybe you could make it up here, but as it turned out, your schedule wouldn't allow for it. So we're thankful that you're talking to us this morning. But you're absolutely right. There are a lot of places that enjoy and have activities during April, especially being the National Poetry Month. And you mentioned a poet just a moment ago. Can you give us a little rundown of some of your favorites and why they might be?
Okay, well, it's a difficult question for people who have lots of favorites.
Yeah.
But one of my favorites is Elizabeth Bishop's One Art, which is a highly structured poem. It's a villanelle, a poem that repeats lines, but it sounds conversational, and so as you read it or listen to it, you don't have any or much sense. You begin to hear some rhymes, but other than that, you don't have much sense of how highly structured it is, and I think that's a remarkable accomplishment. It begins, "The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost, that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master." And so those are the repeat lines. The art of losing isn't hard to master,
Right.
And it's not a disaster. But and it, then the losses get more severe as you move through the poem. So that's one of my favorites. Probably the first poem that I ever loved was a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, and totally for personal reasons. The poem is called Spring and Fall, and it begins, "Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove and leaving?" So it was my name in there, and I thought he was talking to me.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true of a lot of poetry, and I suspect you would back me up on that. People find identification with them because of a personal nature. In your case, maybe a name, maybe an incident, maybe a relationship, which is, of course, part of the beauty of poetry in general. It speaks to people in a variety of ways.
That's very true, yes. There's something about the way poetry gets to something essential that touches people.
So now that you have been the Poet Laureate for over a year and are entering your second year, what kind of advice might you give to an audience if you were speaking to them for the first time, and after you've sort of done some icebreakers about poetry, which a lot of people still find intimidating? What can you tell them about embracing poetry?
Well, I think to be alert for poems that you do speak to you and that you love. The Kimberly Blazer, who was the Poet Laureate 2 Poet Laureates ago, had a project that was recording people reciting poems that they had committed to heart. And there is an interactive map on the Wisconsin Poet Laureate website, a map of Wisconsin with dots where she recorded somebody reciting a poem that they love. So that's a place where you can find poems that other people really enjoyed that much that they took the time and the trouble to memorize them. A lot of people want help in beginning to write a poem, and that's great. So first of all, you want to be alert to language. Where do you hear interesting words? You might want to keep a word list that you want to work into your own poems. But find a poem that you like and identify several things that the poem does, and then try to do that in your, pick up those techniques, pick up those strategies to use for yourself.
Okay, well, I'm going to kind of wind up. I don't want to keep you any longer. I know you have a tight schedule. You're probably off somewhere again today to speak. So are Are you on the committee? I'm going to use that word kind of loosely here for projecting or picking the next poet laureate, because your reign will end in about 10 months. So how do you help with the finding the next person?
Okay, the Wisconsin Poet Laureate Commission, a group of representatives of organizations that continued the Poet Laureate program after it was cut from the state budget, they are the official body to pick the next Poet Laureate. I am an ex officio member, not a voting member, but I will be in the interview when the three finalists are interviewed, and so I will have some say-so about that. But the applications will be available in August. The applications will be on the Wisconsin Poet Laureate website.
Okay. Well, we're going to wind this up. I'm going to just ask you kind of shamelessly if you want to give us a final poem, a favorite poem of yours, or any kind of a little message about poetry before we end here. And for our listeners, heading into April, which is Poetry Month.
Okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity. I kind of thought you would ask me that, so... Here's a poem that I wrote as part of the 50th anniversary of Milwaukee's Fair Housing Marches. We did a poetry chapbook anthology called Where I Want to Live. My poem is called Cake and Lemonade for Neighbors. Where I want to live, neighbors gather on front porches, watch their children play across multiple front yards, laugh in Spanish, Arabic, Burmese, English, talk about back in the day, share sweet and savory snacks, lend each other a cup of sugar or flour, borrow hedge trimmers, a shovel or rake, help with chores when need be, apologize when need be, offer a word of advice, not more, strum guitars and pluck banjos, make a little noise sometimes bring out a kitchen chair so everyone finds a comfortable place to sit on the unscreened, wide or narrow porch or on the stoop. Sometimes just enjoy all black, brown, white, golden quiet together.
Wonderful image, Margaret. That's a wonderful image. And with that, I think we'll conclude. I want to really thank you so much for giving us your time. Wish you the rest. We wish you the best in the rest of your reign as Poet Laureate, and hopefully you'll get a chance to get into Waupaca sometime in the next 10 months, maybe for a reading here or a gathering. We'd love to have you if that ever works in your schedule, and look forward to reading and hearing more of your work. So thank you so much for allowing us to talk this morning.
Thank you.